Greetings again, dear friends. Thanks for joining me and the Reverend Dr. John Edgar for this edition of Faith and Works. I want to remind all of you that these are intended to be conversations that will stir us up to good works and to love, and also help us to see, a la James chapter 2, how work joins faith. We are not lacking in good words to express the Christian faith, but sometimes each and all of us are lacking in the work that should accompany that faith. We've seen that poignantly in a number of areas, and several of these conversations that I've posted recently have focused on the matter of race and racism in our times, which is not just a challenge in the United States, but around the world, and not just outside of the church. It's sometimes true inside of the church. The Reverend Dr. John Edgar, who is the Executive Director of Community Development for All People and the immediate past lead pastor of Church for All People on the south side of Columbus, is my guest today. And he is one of my white brothers. And so I just think he already knew I was going to say this, guys. I invited him because of that in part, but also because of the work he has done and the commitments that he's had across decades to make changes in the way our society and our church is structured. So I appreciate, Pastor John, that you're with us, and thanks for being with us. You've got a long track record, not just at Church for All People. You've been a district superintendent. You have served congregations that you have led to be increasingly diverse, and they looked different after you've left. Tell us a little bit about some of the ways you've served the church and the community across the years.
Sure. So I graduated from seminary in 1978, and almost all of my time in local churches has spent in congregations that were racially diverse, at least by the time I was leaving. So a lot of my ministry in local churches has been in neighborhood, and so congregations that have been predominantly white, and then African-American folks moving into the community. And so in those journeys, I've learned a lot, more often than not by listening rather than speaking, about the life experiences, the hopes and aspirations and struggles of very diverse people. And I am convinced, the longer I live, that when we listen to each other, when we come together and truly relationships of mutuality, just to be the body of Christ, that things do get better as long as we don't pretend that there aren't issues beneath the surface. As I sometimes say, the thing that worries me the most is when I hear a white person tell me that they are truly colorblind, because it doesn't exist. And in fact, I think it's a statement of saying that they have blinders on, and for whatever combination of reasons, there's a reluctance and anxiety to truly face the issue. But when we are honest, comfortable in our own skins, and then listen and join hands with one another, it's remarkable, Bishop, what we can achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've really kind of gone for the gusto, and I've got two macro questions that I told you I wanted to visit about. So you've gone there a bit about the colorblind narrative that some people try to live with. I've been pretty public, even at annual conference. I do see color, and I want people to see my color. And my mantra is, I don't want my color or your color or any sister and brother's color in the church or in the society to be a hindrance to relationship. But I don't want to not see it. It would make the world pretty dull. And since the color, whether in flowers or in the world of art or in our human bodies, is a gift from God. So the goal is not color blindness. The goal is not to allow difference to be a hindrance or a barrier. So here's the question.
Sure.
Why have you learned, or what have you learned about why it's so difficult for some people, and particularly white sisters and brothers, to talk about race, to talk about racism? And I want to say to the audience, I'm not persuaded that there aren't people who are not white who also find it a challenge to talk about race. But today I want to get it from that perspective.
Uh, I would say a couple of reasons that I think are very common among white Christian folks, white United Methodist folks, that make it hard at times to talk honestly about race. First of all, lots of white folks carry around an interesting kind of underlying guilt. In other words, it's really hard to be aware in this society and not know that we have racial inequities that are just baked in. It's the legacy of racism, 400 years since slavery began in this country. And pretty much everybody, when they're honest, knows that this still is passed on. The sins of the mothers and fathers are passed on to their children for multiple generations. And so there is a sense, just absolute, that white people benefit, from some of that history of racism, and they benefit from some of that legacy that continues. So that's awkward, And so that's one thing that makes it hard for people to talk about it. The other thing is, and being a little bit playful on this, but church folks, particularly, not only United Methodists, but others, we've allowed guilt to just get worked into our religion in ways it's not always healthy. And so white folks can be uncomfortable because they know they're benefiting from the system. And then they also can be very uncomfortable at times because they feel guilty about it and don't know quite what to do, And so, at times it's interesting, all my ministry pretty much has been spent in settings where Black folks and white folks are together all the time. And it's interesting for some white folks who maybe haven't interacted a lot with African-American folks. There's this sense to figuratively and sometimes literally begin by just wanting to apologize for being white, which really doesn't accomplish anything. In other words, we are who we are, and again, it's important to get comfortable in our skins. But that's a real issue, to try to make sense of the fact I have benefited in ways that I really didn't necessarily earn or deserve, and I know that. So how should I feel about it? So that can create an awkwardness. And then there's another part to this. I was born in 1953. I grew up in Cincinnati and in St. Louis in the suburbs. So I'm old enough that some of the toxicity, and I use the word intentionally, of what it was like when we still had so many laws of segregation, Jim Crow laws that were still functioning. So, in St. Louis, I have memories as a young child of going to a gas station, and there'd be the restroom for men and for women, and then colored, and the same for drinking fountains. And the drinking fountain that the white folks could use, had cooled water, and the one for Black folks, was just, kind of almost just like a spout there. And all I mean by that is that stuff is in us. And the way I try to think about it and talk about it to people I care, it's like a heavy metal toxicity that is in all of us. Sometimes this gets described as implicit bias, and that's not a bad use of the term, the things we're not even aware of. But that's in us, Bishop. And so when white folks get serious about wanting to address issues of race, to build authentic relationships with people who are African American, it's all these different things. We know that we benefited, we've drunk from the wells we did not dig, but somebody else dug those who isn't getting the chance to drink from them, in this analogy. We don't know, white folks sometimes, what to do with that sense of guilt. And then at the same time, there's this toxicity in us, and it doesn't have to define us, but very few people enjoy looking at the underside of themselves, and that stuff's in us. And the more we can own it, try to bring it out into the light, like any other thing, that's been harmful or negative in our lives, when we can face it, we do better. And what I'm convinced is white folks do the are at their best in addressing all that I've talked about when we simply get over any initial anxiety and find ways to hang out with African American folks. And there's no better place to do that than in a church, because in a church, we're trying to be at our best. We've got the language of grace that helps us make sense of what it is that has happened before we cannot change, but God loves us just the way we are, as we say at Church for All People, and God's not finished with us yet. So the church is that amazing place to deal with all this stuff that makes white people reluctant to get serious to begin with.
That's fabulous. So, I mean, a couple of things, so you've got the privilege thing, you've got the guilt and shame thing, which can get on steroids, period, about any subject matter.
Yep.
And I've found, I think I've said this in homilies, you have too, that I haven't tended to grow when I got burdened down with guilt and shame. So acknowledging I'm wrong about something that Greg did or something that I am, and that I believe God wants to be different, acknowledging it is important, getting burdened down like a load of bricks. And then this description, I love this description that you've offered around toxicity. My brain went to saying it's sort of like, the physical effects of lead poisoning that we learn.
Very much, yeah.
Or carbon monoxide poisoning, and it's in us. And what hit me is you said it's in all of us. So the effects of racism are not just painful or harmful to any particular color group, black, white, brown, etc. And we all live with that. So it also sounds, John, like you're saying that avoiding it is maybe sort of the opposite of the guilt thing.
Yeah, right.
Just throw us. Yeah. I was looking at some social media stuff, and I need to say, since our primary audience is the West Ohio Conference, that recently we got a letter that came to the website that said, said to the director of communications, if you and the bishop would stop talking about it, we wouldn't have a problem. So this is in 2020, June, July. So let's stop talking about it, because we wouldn't have a race problem if you would stop talking about it, would not have it on the website, et cetera. So avoidance and guilt are things that we may want to steer clear of. Here's another one. Saw this on the Council of Bishops Facebook page, that white privilege is a non-existent threat, and therefore doesn't need to be dismantled. I'm making some assumptions. I don't know the individual, that may have been coming from an Anglo sister or brother. So what's the avoidance thing? So if you're not in the guilt mode, what's the avoidance thing about?
Well, I would say, can't speak for any other one individual, but I think often folks in general, and a lot of white folks when it comes to matters of race, folks want to avoid it because of these other underlying things. White folks know that they benefited, unfairly. They know there's not a level playing field. Deep down, this toxicity I was talking about, things that we learned as young children. This gets talked about in different ways, but a white person, without really even thinking about it, sees a large African-American man and is tempted to cross the other side of the sidewalk. Or the other sidewalk. All this stuff, and so there's a lot of avoidance, but it's rooted in these biases that often are beneath the surface, but they fester, and that's what I mean by a toxicity. And so my wife Sue was telling me just recently, when we were talking about this notion of toxicity, they said, so we all need a lot of dialysis, right? In other words, how do we cleanse this? And maybe we don't cleanse it permanently, but we get it back in the open. And so, just even the title that you're working with, the faith and works, that I think a lot of that dialysis, or, don't have to say with that image, how we deal with this, how it gets better, is we get it out in the open, in some cases by talking about it, but it's more often as we're doing something positive together, that that we are able to work through some of those concerns, and we at least can counterbalance some of that. So in other words, again, even at the simplest level, if some white folks at Church for All People are doing a project that involves some African American men, well, when that's a positive interaction, it at least balances out some of that buried stuff from the past about who's scary and who do I need to avoid. I'm not saying it's simplistic, and in that sense, I really think my wife Sue is right. It has a parallel to dialysis. You have to kind of stay at it, because some of that stuff, what's deep, it's there, but it's also true that the core of our faith is amazing grace, including John Newton, the slave trader himself, that we aren't stuck. We shouldn't avoid it out of fear that we can't face it. Instead, get into it and realize that God's grace is always sufficient.
That's fabulous. I love the medical treatment analogy of dialysis. And so thank you, Deaconess Sue, for sharing that with Pastor John to share it with the rest of the world. So you said earlier that every congregation and community you've left has been more inclusive racially and ethnically than when you arrived. Church for All People was started as an intentionally, let me say, interracial church, and of course open to being multiracial as well. So hitting the bullseye of faith and works, we know what the Christian faith says about the image of God is on all of us. So that's teaching, doctrine, we need all that. What's the work that we as church can do? Describe that for us.
Sure. So Church for All People was born out of a direct service that we launched when I was a district superintendent, and I became the founding pastor of the church. But the direct service we did was so simple, and I think it is illustrative, not prescriptive, but illustrative of what can be done. We launched something called the Free Store, and I encourage the members of the 78 churches in what was then the Columbus South District to gather up gently used clothing and household items. We rented a storefront in an interracial neighborhood on the south side of Columbus. And the key was, we asked people from those churches, follow your donations. At least some of you come down and hang out with the people who are going to come and shop, and try to build relationships. So, and it worked, Bishop, in ways we really hadn't imagined. We realized quickly that the Spirit was in the midst of this, because I am convinced that God's Spirit is trying to form the inclusive body of Christ. I don't think there's any question about that. So when we even make fledgling, efforts that seem so small compared to the scale of the issue, God gets in the midst of that. So we had people hanging out and just, volunteers and shoppers, and then we birthed a church out of that. And right now, it is one of the most diverse United Methodist churches in two key categories that are often hard for us as United Methodists. That congregation is half white, half black, like its community around it. About 350 people in worship during the week, prior to COVID-19, and now 500 some people online. But anyway, but it's also a congregation like its community, where the majority of the church members and people in worship have income below the poverty level, and we can come together and do things when we are honest about it. So, and I'd say a couple of things real quick. One's still maybe a little bit on the idea side, but I think it connects. That 2 Sundays from now, I preach very rarely there because I'm the Pastor Emeritus, but I'm preaching again. And going back to 1 Corinthians 12, that section where Paul says that there is one body with many members, and you know this text very well. But I'm going to talk about what does it mean to say we're a church for all people. And part of what I'm going to do is go to the part in there where Paul says, when one part of the body, celebrates, the whole body celebrates. And when one part of the body hurts, the whole body hurts. And I'm just going to remind folks, that's what Black Lives Matter is all about. Paul figured it out 2,000 years ago. And if Paul was here today, Paul would write those same words and say, don't you get it? Of course, Black Lives Matter. if one part of the body hurts, then the whole body hurts. And when one part of the body, celebrates, the whole body does. So by hanging out together, and we've been doing this now for 20 years, we've gotten to know each other, and at our best, that part's sunk in. When one part hurts, we all hurt. And so then we keep trying to find the ways to do things together. So one illustration of something we've been working on for 6 or so years now is that, one of the things we learned about these racial inequities that are baked in has to do with infant mortality. That it's terrible anytime a baby, dies before her first birthday. But on the south side of Columbus, African-American babies die about 3 times more often than white babies, even when you control for social class or how much income people have. And so we said, well, what are we going to do about that? And we don't have all the answers, but we started a program called First Birthdays, where the whole idea was, as a community, we would try to do whatever it takes to make certain every baby on the south side of Columbus celebrates the first birthday. And so we just brought people together, and we do these learning experiences and celebrations, and we've accompanied well over 500 pregnant women through this, and every single one of those babies has celebrated a first birthday. And along the way, Bishop, we are forced to deal with the fact that there's a racial component to how the lack of access to healthcare, the stress that African-American pregnant women go through leads to higher numbers of babies being born too small, too soon. And so there's lots we can learn, and then there's things we can do at the local level. There's not a physician, certainly not an obstetrician in our congregation, but we were able to bring people together. A lot of that actually under the leadership of Deaconess Sue Wolf, who has a public health background. And we've been able, to help people celebrate that now these vulnerable babies, both black and white in our community, are thriving. And when one part of the body, is thriving, then the whole body can thrive as well. And so it's just one place. Another thing, Bishop, that we've just started, because these issues really matter, and I want to tie 2 things together very quickly. Going back to some of the questions you raised at the beginning, why is this so hard? One of the things that I have been convicted on myself in the last several months is that while we bring a lot of people together, there are times that we kind of cop out, and we say, it's going to be easier to keep this black person and this white person together if we don't go too deep on that toxicity beneath the surface. So we've been reflecting that we need to be a bit more bold just in inviting one another. Let's be honest about this stuff, And so starting just last week for the first time, on every Tuesday, we're doing what we call Patio Pathways. Our worship is outside now for all kinds of good reasons. And so on Tuesday evenings, we're just inviting people back outside on a patio behind part of our property to sit and to talk about 2 things. And we put it in the context of hope, not fear. We said that come with us and talk if you have at least some hope, some yearning, that all of this that's going on with protest and different opinions, and if you think this could be the harbinger of something better, then let's come and talk. And let's talk in 2 ways. What do I want to be different about me? What am I still in the process of becoming? Because again, of these things I've talked about. And then at the same time, what do I want to contribute to in our community so that there is more justice and there is more equity? And so, we had 30 some folks who came out black and white, and we're just getting started. And some of it was pretty raw, but I mean, in terms of vulnerability, people just saying, at the same time though, Bishop, by the time that evening was over, what was so clear is people appreciated the honesty in one another, and both white folks and black folks there being able to say, we want it better, and some of that's the work I gotta keep doing on me, that spiritual dialysis. I gotta keep clearing this stuff out. And then the other stuff is, it just can't be about, me feeling guilty or any of that. It's just, what are we going to do? And so we're going to be looking at various parts of that. Just one quick littlest illustration that may not be ready, but one of the folks who doesn't even worship with us, but one of the city attorneys, came because he wanted to hear more from people in the community. And what he shared about, he's working right now to get the Columbus Police Department with the new recruits, the new cadets going through the academy, saying every one of them should be out in the community interacting with low-income people in general and African-American people in particular. And so one of the things we may tackle is how to create that learning environment for at least some of those officers who are in the academy. Just have them come and hang out. So there's a lot we can do about big issues like what's appropriate policing. And it matters at the societal level. But what do we do just at our own local level? And maybe sometimes it's as simple as, and I'm not going to say his name here, but this guy is an active United Methodist, this city attorney in another United Methodist church, and is, and is wrestling with these deep questions about becoming and what do I want to do next, and then is offering that this is something he's working right now to get the police department to do, and to do it. And he wants the kind of neighborhood support that a group like us can do. So Bishop, there's something that we all can do, and the church is a platform for that.
Well, you've described 3 or 4 things that are happening, and all of them are neighborhood, local community related. They could be done in urban and rural communities to the extent that you have a cross-section of population. And certainly poverty pervades every community. And now something you're doing locally, you're saying someone else is saying, boy, that could be done on a wider scale, or we bring the wider scale in the macro to the micro. So that is fabulous. Let me ask one other question, and then we'll shoot for a conclusion here. Your stock and trade and community development for all people, church for all people, other places you've served, has focused significantly on what have been the 2 big groups as placeholders for our racialized history in America, Black and white. In an increasingly racially, ethnically diverse world, any thoughts about how we proceed to widen that reach and that conversation?
Sure. I think it's to realize that the state of Ohio, the boundaries of the West Ohio Conference, are actually much, much more ethnically, racially, and first language diverse than we often think they are. It's that we move in the circles that we're comfortable in, the people we know, and we often miss what's right around us. So I think one of the most important things we can do is just be more intentional. As you said, for one thing, the issue of economic poverty is all around us all the time. And then we just give one other illustration. I mentioned before we do this initiative with pregnant women and families with infants to help babies thrive through the first birthday. Well, a few years ago, we've been doing this about 6 years, about 3 years ago, for the very first time, we brought somebody onto our staff in that initiative, because through our community development corporation, we have about 40 people on staff altogether. It was the first time we had somebody who was truly speaking Spanish as a first language. And there's this sort of myth about the South Side of Columbus. It's Black folks and it's white folks, and that's who's here, okay? And we see not that many Spanish-speaking folks, but as soon as she came on our staff, within just a couple of months, between 25% and a third of everybody in this initiative was now Spanish speaking. And so sometimes it's, if we care enough to listen and to look and to just start, even if we start really small, it's amazing how it can change over time. Wow. And then maybe just on my side, I would conclude by going back to 1 Corinthians 12. Not only, is it a body with many parts, and the hand can't say to the foot, I have no need of you, or the eye to the ear. The other thing, Bishop, is that I am personally convinced, the older I get, that the more inclusive we are, Paul was speaking a truth, not just an idea. The more inclusive we are, the more fully we manifest the living body of Christ, and therefore the spirit of the living Christ is more powerfully present. And we are convinced, though we are in some ways not a big congregation, mostly people of low income, we can have impact, that faith to action, because we are more inclusive. So every day, 600 different people come to shop in our fresh market, who are wanting to eat healthy, to live healthy. Bishop, this summer we will complete we will get to the point of having done $100 million of affordable housing.
Wow.
And I sincerely believe, Bishop, the answer to that, the secret sauce is simply that the more inclusive the body, the more powerfully present the Spirit is. And so if we're concerned our church is anemic, maybe part of it is we just need to get more parts of the body there.
Amen. Well, what a concluding word. Thank you, Pastor John Edgar. And I want to say, friends, thanks for joining us again for another edition of Faith and Works. Please remember that James teaches us that faith without works is dead. And to pick up on something that Pastor John said earlier about getting bogged down in guilt and shame, which demotivates us to actually do the work. I want to quote from a great hymn writer, Charles Albert Tinley, who has a hymn where he says, "I am free from condemnation. Jesus Christ has set me free." And I want to say to all of you, dear friends, let's live together in the freedom that Jesus Christ has given each one of us. God bless you. God bless you, Pastor John, and God keep you.
Thanks much. Bye-bye.